All right. So what I have open now is the scene where I flipped the background horizontally to match the lookdev file from Photoshop. And so I simply just took everything for the environment. So you can see the ground, the volume primitives, uh, random rocks I'd put in here, the bones that I'd placed, my sky dome, all the lights, the walls, and lights having to do with the environment, which is the directional lights. And just took that group and -1 scaled it. So simple enough way to flip it horizontally. And with that done, then a couple things to point out. Once I flipped the environment horizontally, and I was going to be looking and seeing more of this area, I did decide to go in and put a bunch of bones. I had a little bit in the scene, but I added a few more. And so I just took a skeleton model and just, that was already in pieces and just broke it up and scattered bones all over the place. So if we just go into another camera and let's go and grab some of them. Blink. You can see it's just skulls and ribs and bones just scattered around the ground just to add a little bit of detail. They're not super obvious they're not really noticeable in the animation, but in the still, in the print, which is 6K and printed about 4 feet or 4.5 feet wide, when you have a print where people can stand up, close to it and sit and stare and look around for detail, I think it's cool to just have, stuff in there for people to notice. And so that's what that is. And then as far as the final lighting, so changes that occurred as a result of the look dev, I'd already decided that the lighting from the pits would be area lights. So you can see I've got area lights inside here. I don't have one big one just because of the fact that technically, this would cast a shadow and the way that area lights deal with decay and drop off. Because for this area light, I have no decay on them. I'm just using the intensity on it, and it's going to cast a shadow. Because if you turn on decay for an area light, it decays from the center out, so it'll be a lot brighter here than it is on the sides. While if it has no decay, you get this more sort of linear illumination like you would expect from the shape of the area light. So I prefer how they look without decay, but then I wouldn't get a shadow that would make sense from the bridge, so I just broke it up into multiple area lights. And then same here, you can see I made an extra area light to represent the light bleeding that would happen from the fog that's going to be rising from it. Because also in that lookdev Photoshop file, the fog effects rising from the pits get a lot stronger, and they would obviously cause light to bleed up onto the walls. So we can see I have a bunch of area lights inside here. So basically, I have my up area lights coming from within the pit, the one big area light right there. I still have all the point lights that are inside the walls, just so it looks like there's illumination coming from inside the structure. And then the main lighting for the environment is these directional lights that are off right now just because I was probably doing test renders, but if I turn them on, we can see I've got these 3 directional lights. So one that's coming from behind with a very low intensity, 0.2. One that's coming into the scene with another low intensity, 0.3. And then this one, 0.8, which is sort of the key light, which we can see has a cool color to it. While these you can see also have a cool color, and that one's a warm color, the one coming from behind. So I have one warm light because I decided at this point I wanted the sky to be warm with a couple cool lights. So we're just creating a warm, cool color palette in the image, relatively saturated. And that's basically the key lights for the environment. So the entire environment is 3 directional lights, a bunch of area lights for the pits, and then a bunch of point lights inside these structures. But the character is actually lit differently because I rendered the character separately and composited it. So the lighting that's on the environment is not the same as lighting that's on the character. And so, meaning that since I rendered them separately, I wanted to sort of light him where he's still using the main directional lights for the environment, but I also wanted to go in and do a couple specific things for him. One is, if you remember before, I did have these point lights on the sides, but based on the paint over from Photoshop, to create some cast shadows onto the character, to make things make it feel like there's more objects off camera behind us and to the sides. What I did to create the shadows that are raking across the character is I just added some objects that would literally cast shadows. And so you can see that I have a point light here, and I have another point light here. And then these objects are literally in there to create shadows. And these point lights, if I look inside here to shadows, you can see are creating soft shadows. The light radius is at 1 for both of them. And so that's creating the shadows that are raking onto the character from the sides. And then you'll see I went and took my, some of the elements from the walls and copied them and put a cube, just being interested that, if I get any cast shadows from my light that's coming into the scene in the foreground, to darken it, because if we go back to Photoshop, the whole foreground in here in this lookdev file got a little bit darker, as if there's, a large wall casting a shadow. And so therefore I created that in 3D. But then there's a little bit of a gap right here, and I have this point light that's illuminating the character. And then I created a couple objects in front of that point light to cast shadows on him. So it obviously took quite a few test renders to figure out the correct positioning for these objects that are casting shadows onto him. And so the reason, for example, that I have one closer to the character than the other has to do with the fact that I'm using ray trace soft shadows on this spotlight, as we can see here. Then an object that's closer to the light is going to create a harder shadow on the character, or rather a softer shadow, and the object that's closer to the character will create a harder shadow onto the character. And so therefore I'm getting a variety of edge weights or edge softness, which also will imply intuitively that effect. So you can see in this paint over that the cast shadow in this region is soft, while this one here is hard. And so it creates an interesting effect as far as the feeling that, we know intuitively that something that has a harder edge shadow is closer to the object that is receiving the shadow, and something with a soft edge shadow must be farther away. And so to simulate that, that's why I have things set up this way. And to do it in 3D, as opposed to sort of trying to cheat it, was important just because then if the character moves around, because in the animation obviously he comes towards camera at one point, it sort of makes the effect a lot more believable. So that is sort of our final light rig. So point lights, area lights, and directional lights for the environment, and then directional lights, point lights, and a spotlight for the character. And then also importantly to point out, based on the look dev, is you'll notice that his head is a lot brighter than the bottom. So the intensity of the light as it goes down the body is diminishing. And so to control that, that's why I switched to a spotlight for the character instead of a directional light, because the directional light has uniform intensity in the entire scene. And so a spotlight allows me to add drop off to it so that it can be brighter in the cone and get darker as it goes towards the edges. But with that said, you can see I don't have any drop off inside here. I have the cone angle. I have no decay because it's only illuminating the character, so I don't need to worry about it decaying off into the distance. I have a little bit of penumbra just to soften the edge, we can see in the preview here. But instead of using drop-off, what I did is I actually texture mapped the color of the light with a gobo. And so this right here you can see is a texture, and then I just multiplied the black and white texture with a blue color so that it's still a blue light illuminating the character. And for that gobo, if we go into Photoshop, let's go into textures, spotlight gobo, where is that? Give me a second to find it. There we go. Demo spot gobo. So, or Demos spot gobo. So Demos at this point is still the name I'm giving the project. And so it's a spotlight. And if I open that, basically what you'll see inside here is that I look through the spotlight. So I take that spotlight and I look through it. And then when I look through it, obviously it's going to be a little bit far away. So I can go in, get a little closer by adjusting overscan and display options. And then I just do a screen grab and then crop into that screen grab in Photoshop. So here you can see I hit everything but the character. And then I can go and paint exactly what I might want. So these things that I have here are just me testing the orientation of the gobo to make sure it's lining up on the character when I did test renders correctly. And then basically the final one looks like it was that, but you'd see at some point I had something where, you know, if I set this to multiply, you can see the lighting is going to be brighter on his head and get darker as it goes down the body, but it's still bright on the entire scythe. So that's why it has this shape to it. So, you know, bright where the head is, bright for the entire scythe, but dimmer as it goes down the body. So painting your own custom gel or gobo and mapping it to the color of the light gives you a very precise way to control how light falls in your character, like I'm getting inside here. So the light fall off from bright up here to dark down here is done with a gobo mapped to the light color, but then the shadows that are casting across the character are being done with actual 3D geometry that's casting ray trace shadows onto the character. And so that's how I got that look. So if we look at our look dev file, but then we open our final comp, which is here, we can see obviously from this look dev file to the final I changed things a bit. This for me was just a little bit too dark and gloomy. So obviously my final I brightened things up a little bit. But as far as the effect on the character, the shadows that are being cast onto him are 3D shadows coming from the sides as well as from the top. And so that's pretty much the final lighting for this scene. So let me just go in there and see if there's anything else worth pointing out. So spotlight for the character. Objects in front of him just to cast shadows from our key light, which again is right here. This is the one with the highest intensity. So you can see since that's coming into the scene to illuminate the environment, by creating these objects, it just means that the foreground area here is going to be a little bit darker because it's going to have a cast shadow from these. So some shadow casting objects, area lights, directional lights, point lights, one spotlight, a gobo on it, and that's my lighting for the scene. So the next thing then to talk about is to talk about the fog a little bit. And the way, once I finalized my lighting, I decided to render out my different passes for the background, the character, Z-depth, and fog. Because I tend to do that by creating separate scene files. So what we'll see right now is that we are at 27. So that's the file we have open right now. But you'll see I have some other scene files associated with it. And those are my Z-depth pass, the fog from the pits that's coming up, ambient occlusion, which I ended up not using, and my environment fog. So we're going to take a look at those scene files next, and so that we can then start getting into things like the locusts and effects and final compositing. So there you go.